Um, I'm so happy that we're discussing what we're discussing tonight. It's a very important moment for us. Um, the concepts of nonviolence are somewhat understood by sections of the movements today in many parts of the world. What's less understood is the concept of nonviolence as a way of developing a post-militaristic society that is civilian nonviolent defense. This is a challenge for us all. It's sort of the new era of how we can use nonviolence in a way to change the world. And it needs a lot of exploration, a lot of reflection, which is what we're going to be doing tonight. I think before I introduce the panel, I wonder if people want to just spend 2 minutes looking over the um, points. Some people may have read the article, Making the Abolition of War a Reasonable Goal, but here is a quick summary that people can absorb for a couple of minutes just before we start our discussion. I hope people have absorbed at least a couple of the points. Um, and some people are very familiar with this, others may not be. Could I introduce our panelists? The three panelists are Richard Sandbrook, who's Professor Emeritus at U of T. Richard has also Vice President of Science for Peace. Richard has written now several articles on a nonviolent defense of Canada and is working on a book on this subject and is fast emerging as Canada's leading theorist on nonviolent civilian defense. Um, Isaiah Ritzmann is a longtime community organizer who's organized education in the areas of ecology and has organized uh, homes for refugees and is working on a project which is called, and I have to think of it because it's new to me, an electoral uh, cooperate for Canada, an electoral concept that has a uniting perspective to unite the country electorally in the face of the development of the right wing politics that we are now facing. And I'd like to introduce also Magdalee Brunache, who is Science for Peace's Blumenfeld Fellow, is a graduate student at U of T, and is working deeply in the area of Haiti. So we start then with Richard Sandbrook. My nose. Oh, I've cut your nose. Not good. I know that's sorry.
Very short talk.
Klepto, sorry.
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for turning out. Um, I'll try and keep to 15 minutes. I was originally going to use my phone to give me a buzz at 15 minutes, but my phone just ran out of juice. So if I do go on too long, do please let me know. Okay. So my view is that Sharp's program for abolishing war is still the most plausible plan out there. But Sharp's um, politics of implementing the plan is lacking. And that, I think, is the reason why we're no further ahead today with this program than we were in 1980, although of course there were several experiments in civilian-based defense in, um, in the early 1990s, especially in the Baltic states. So I want first to look at Sharpe's approach very briefly, to say where I agree and where I differ somewhat. Well, first, he begins by saying that war leads to immense chaos and devastation, and therefore we need an alternative. We can certainly accept that as being true. And to abolish war, we need to have a realistic alternative, he says. And that realistic alternative is a gradual evolution towards civilian-based defense, as he calls it. And that to begin with, there would be a kind of um, dual defense based on military and on civilian-based defense. But over time, civilian-based defense, if it proves itself, would in fact become the dominant element and eventually the only element of defense in a country. Okay, well that seems reasonable enough. I mean, it's an interesting theory. So his view was that what we had to do as scholars and researchers of nonviolent defense was to demonstrate the potential viability of this mode of defense. And if we could do that, we could gain a great deal of support with government for experimenting in that mode of defense. At the beginning, he said only a handful of states would adopt civilian-based defense, but over time, more would be attracted to it when they saw how effective and efficient civilian-based defense could be. So that's, and he also finally suggested that the mutually assured destruction logic of nuclear weapons would be negated by civilian-based defense for reasons I won't go into now, but he had a whole discussion of nuclear deterrence and how civilian-based defense could operate within those parameters. So let's assume that our goal is the same as that of Gene Sharpe, which is to create this dual defense of a violent and a nonviolent um, nature. Now, of course, it's going to be very difficult to articulate that kind of joint deployment because each of these modes of defense clearly operates according to a different logic, a conflicting logic. So it'll be very difficult. But let's assume it's possible on an interim basis to work out a joint deployment of these two forms of defense. So how would we go about getting to that point of a joint deployment so that civilian-based defense could be used to begin with as a rather small element of defense, supplementary to the army, to the military, but over time take on a much larger role? Well, first of all, what countries are the more likely candidates for civilian-based defense? Not the superpowers, for obvious reasons, I think. Therefore, smaller and middle powers. Uh, Smaller middle powers, yes, but not superpowers. Uh, Among the small and middle powers, not the autocracies, the authoritarian regimes. There's no way they would ever institute civilian-based defense. So that narrows it down to liberal, democratic, small and middle range countries. And among that group of countries, the ones that are most likely to take it up are those that are on the periphery or close to a hostile great power. So Russia, China, and the United States. So from that point of view, the most likely states to adopt it would be the Baltic states, the Nordic states, Poland, Taiwan, Philippines, Canada, Colombia, and Panama, let's say, right now, as countries that feel somewhat threatened by a great power. Among this group of countries, Canada, I think, is the most likely prospect for civilian-based defense, for the main reason being that Canada, if it ever were to be invaded by the US, which of course is unlikely, they're more likely to engage in hybrid warfare to try and develop Canada as a vassal state than to actually try and invade and conquer Canada. But um, if they were to do so, Canada would have to stand alone. It would, of course, have the verbal support of NATO countries, but it's very unlikely that the European NATO countries would actually engage the United States militarily, would come to US, Canada's aid, with military, uh, with armed, with armed soldiers. So we would be on our own, and we know we'd face a devastating confrontation with the US. So in Canada, if we narrowed it down to Canada, what are the political obstacles we need to overcome to reach the situation of a joint deployment of military defense and civilian-based defense? Um, well, of course, let me just run through them quickly. To begin with, it's obvious that the power structure is unfavorable to nonviolent defense. And one major aspect of that power structure is the military, industrial, intellectual complex, which exists in Canada as well as in the US and also in the various European countries. And there is in the military, industrial, intellectual complex um, strong vested interest in an expanding military defense budget. So this complex includes, of course, not only military officers, politicians are interested in donations, um, consultants, arms manufacturers, uh, think tanks, but also shareholders in corporations that make weapons, for example, and law firms involved. There's a large group, very powerful structure, which would not, at the outset at least, be interested in nonviolent defense. Secondly, government. Now, governments are by nature cautious, and they are unlikely, let's face it, they're very unlikely to, on their own initiative, take up civilian-based defense, because this is a major shift whose implications are likely to be profound, but are also hard to predict. So why would they take it up? It's much easier and on them to just stay with the tried and true, which is military defense. So the governments will be very skeptical from the outset. Then, of course, there is the popular culture of violence and martial valor. And opponents of civilian-based defense or nonviolent defense would refer to the passive to nonviolent defense as being passive and really unmanly. So here we need the counter narrative of the courage required by nonviolent defense, which of course is very true, as it needs a great deal of courage to actually do many of the activities associated with a nonviolent defense. Another obstacle, a fourth obstacle, is that nonviolent defense in Canada, as elsewhere, would quickly become a partisan issue. Now, Sharp suggested that civilian-based defense needed to be a transpartisan issue. It was not to be an ideologically oriented process. It was to be a neutral process, and people should support it in society on the basis of patriotism. Now, that kind of reasoning might have had sway, let's say, in the 1960s and 70s. It has much less sway today in the midst of political polarization, and also the use of internet for conspiracy theorists. And the reality is that nonviolent defense would be quickly characterized by the far right and the not so far right as a left-wing plot, basically to inhibit the liberties of Canadians. And if you think of who it is that might be open to nonviolent defense from the voters' point of view, you have to begin with the NDP. You'd have a number of people in the NDP would be supported. The Liberal Party, smaller but still a majority probably of them could be brought online. The Green Party, probably a strong majority, if not nearly all of them. And many of those who vote Bloc Québécois as well would be sympathetic. Among the conservatives, the those who used to be called progressive conservatives might be interested, but the large MAGA and traditionalist segment of the Conservative Party would not be on board with civilian-based defense. So that's the fourth problem, that would be divisions within Canada to deal with, as well as the regional divisions. So that Alberta in particular, but maybe Alberta and Manitoba would not be, the governments would not be sympathetic, I'll put it lightly, to the idea of a nonviolent defense force being set up in those provinces. So things look bad for nonviolent defense, the way I put it. But there are, I think, exceptional conjunctural conditions which mean that it is possible that we could gain nonviolent defense, an experiment in nonviolent defense in Canada. And those conditions are the following. Number one, many Canadians feel threatened by the United States. It's clear in opinion polls, with 60 or 70% fearing some kind of intervention, being very much opposed to Trump. People are also convinced that military defense would fail, but also be devastating. As for an alternative to military defense, some have suggested that we have an armed and continuing insurgency. I don't regard that as very, very likely in Canada. I mean, we're not like the Afghans with a culture of a martial culture brought up in. I just don't see that many Canadians taking to the hills. I mean, you don't have rifles anyway in many cases. But so I mean, Charlie Angus for a long time promoted this idea that we'd respond with an armed insurgency, but I think he's moving a little bit away from that and more towards a nonviolent defense in his last several posts. Yeah. So another positive conjunctural factor that could play into this Canadian situation is the national service. So the government has put forward the idea of having a national service of 100,000 volunteers to begin with, up to 300,000 eventually. And here is the ideal opportunity to train this national service in nonviolent strategy and tactics. Well, maybe as well they can take on military duties. I mean, I think you're gonna have trade-offs here. So I could say they could learn both, but they'd be able to engage in nonviolent defense, and that would be a major group in Canada who could do so. Now, another argument in favor of nonviolent defense is that it's not just a matter of dealing with the unlikely event of an invasion by the US. I mean, it may happen, but it probably won't. And the thing is that nonviolent defense is also effective in countering what is already ongoing, in fact, which is hybrid warfare. In the same way that the European countries have to deal with Russia and hybrid warfare, Canadians have to begin to deal now with the hybrid warfare practiced by the United States. And by that I mean hybrid warfare includes a whole range of tactics, including economic pressure, threats, sabotage, of course, invasion if necessary. Yes, support of separatists and disinformation campaigns. So this is kind of the terrain of non-hybrid warfare. Well, already, are we at my time? Okay, so we've already in Canada reached the stage of support for separatists in Alberta from the US government, and also some say disinformation campaigns meant to divide Canada. So this, the kind of civic engagement and uh, information and solidarity created by nonviolent defense is very important, not only in the chance of having to deal with invasion, but in dealing also with these forms of hybrid warfare. So what I'm suggesting is that with this form of defense, we mustn't get we mustn't get locked into a binary notion of either military defense or um, nonviolent defense. We mustn't also get the notion of a binary uh, division between top-down or bottom-up approaches to nonviolent defense. In fact, a top-down defense is more the sharp approach. Some Europeans use the bottom-up approach through civil society to develop nonviolent defense. In Canada, we need both. We need pressure on government. And the more that we have support from below, the more pressure there is on government. So we need to have this dual strategy. I might say that the Canadian Coalition for Nonviolent Defense, in fact, has precisely that strategy. Thank you.
And I neglected to say that Richard and Isaiah are the co-coordinators and co-founders of the Canadian Coalition for Nonviolent Defense, along with Jan Slovak from, yes, from thank you, from Conscience Canada. And they have a website. We have a website, so you can check that out. I'd like to introduce Isaiah now.
Thanks, Ellie, and thank you, Richard, for your thoughts. Just get my notes out here. So I feel like what I'll present tonight is the temporal opposite of what Richard is talking about. So Richard is talking about in the short term, how do we achieve a nonviolent defense in Canada, particularly in the contingency of a US invasion in the next couple of years, where I'm going to focus more on the long term. In his article, if you've read it, Gene Sharp talks about transarmament, this long-term process of shifting from a military defense system to a nonviolent defense system. Richard, in his talk, talked about like transitional stages and joint deployment and transitional stages, and I'm going to be talking about the end stage, where we can have a demilitarized defense system. So just to start, nonviolent defense, as we've been talking about, is about the use of nonviolent action to defend a country against military invasion. It's rooted in the history of nonviolent resistance, and it seeks to address the root problem behind war, which is people's need for security. If people believe they can defend themselves against an invasion nonviolently, they would see less of a need to maintain an army. And if such perceptions spread across societies, public support for militarization and war would decline. I'm just going to put my timer on so I know my time. In Gene Sharp's essay, he proposes a long-term process of transarmament, of transitioning from military defense systems to nonviolent defense systems, and he says this is a realistic goal. By talking about it both as a realistic goal and a long-term process, he implies that nonviolent defense systems are both possible, but that certain things still need to be achieved, that certain conditions still need to be met for these systems to be fully implemented. In this presentation, I want to focus on the general population, what the general population needs to know, what they need to value, and what they need to be able to do if a nonviolent defense system is to be fully operational. I was trying to think of a good metaphor for what I'm describing here. And if you remember CERB during the pandemic, we had a really significant economic emergency. And so we had an emergency policy, which was essentially a kind of basic income. But of course, Canada doesn't have a basic income system. I think that can actually be an analogy for what we're talking about here. In the short to medium term, emergency measures like nonviolent defense can be achieved in emergencies. But as Richard pointed out, there are barriers for it to become actually our defense policy. So I'm going to be talking about this long-term transitional goal here. So what are the knowledges, the will, and the skill that needs to be widespread to make what Sharp calls the abolition of war an actual possibility? Now, I'm not saying these are the only conditions that need to be met, but the conditions I talk about here are necessary, they are important, and they're not conditions that Sharp talks about. So I want to identify these because I believe if we can be very clear about what we need, we have more of a chance of getting what we need. As Alice in Wonderland says, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. But I believe we can identify these conditions clearly, and if we do, we'll multiply our chances of achieving them and making war end. Now, as a starting point, I feel it's important to identify a key assumption I'm making. In sharing the assumption that I share the assumption that Gene Sharp had, that there is good reason to believe that nonviolent defense is workable, and that more research and development is needed. When I say more research and development is needed, what I mean is we already know enough to know that nonviolence can work. But nonviolence can work even better and in more complex and challenging circumstances if we did this R&D work. I believe if the US invaded now, nonviolent resistance would be Canada's best defense. But I believe long-term, to abolish militaries, there's a lot more learning and development we can collectively need to do. I'm with Sharp. We can make the abolition of war a realistic goal, but this is going to take investment. I want to transition now to the first condition. What do general populations need to know about nonviolent defense for it to be viable as a system? What understanding needs to be widespread? So quickly, a definition, an analogy, and a caveat. First, by general population, I mean most adults in a society. And there is precedent for certain knowledge or skills to be shared by most adults. For example, literacy. And that's my second point. When I'm talking about general knowledge of nonviolence, a good analogy would be literacy. We can measure literacy, and we can measure it by degrees and gradients. Furthermore, for most of human history, most people in most societies were illiterate, and we've achieved a level of literacy in Western societies, for example, that is remarkable. And I think that is a good precedent for what we're able to achieve in terms of spreading general knowledge. So when I talk about nonviolent literacy, I mean a basic grasp of the methods and mechanisms of nonviolent action. Finally, a caveat. What I'm proposing here are not final answers, but I hope I'm asking questions about what kind of literacy we actually need to make this realizable. So I'm going to give a couple case studies from the science of learning that help us think through these questions. I'll share each study and then give a little bit of a commentary. So the first study is actually about 120 years old. Researchers in the States took two groups of students and they had them throw a dart underwater at 12 inches away. And they found when both groups, through practice, learned how to hit that target under the water. But then the second group was taught the physics of refraction, so how light bends in water. That group, when the target was moved, was able to learn and adapt their strategies faster. My point is learning from experience is important, but learning from theory and experience is better. Applied to nonviolent defense, case studies, including Gandhi and Martin Luther King and beyond, are not by themselves enough. People also need to know basic principles, like Moro Jiu-Jitsu or security defections, many that Sharp discusses even in his earlier work. And this will help them apply nonviolent resistance to the specific context of a military invasion. Just as understanding refraction helped people hit targets underwater when the targets were moved, so too, theory can help whole populations prepare for nonviolent defense. Again, I'm not talking about people being experts here. I'm talking about a kind of nonviolent literacy. The science of learning calls this transfer, how learners apply learning learned in one context to another. And in the science of transfer, scholars warn against over-specificity, when people only know how to apply the knowledge they've learned in one area to that area and they can't apply it to other contexts. An example, if any of you have had children or know of people who have children, what you know about raising one child doesn't always transfer to the next one. If you do the same thing with your eldest and your youngest has a very different personality, it won't work. You can get stuck, as people are laughing. I think this is a understandable example. Applied to nonviolence, overspecificity would warn us that, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the audio here. Overspecificity in nonviolence may be able, sorry, I'm getting really distracted by the audio here. Basically, applied to nonviolence, overspecificity would be like, oh, it worked for Gandhi, it worked for Martin Luther King, but I have no idea how it works in other contexts. That's what overspecificity is. And when we're talking about nonviolent literacy at a general population level, that is one thing we'll have to figure out. How do people actually understand how nonviolence works versus being overly focused on specific case studies where it has worked? Then I'm noticing how long I'm taking. The next example I'll briefly talk about is how young children learn that the world is round. When toddlers and others are first experiencing the world, they look out and they see it's flat. And at some point, they learn that the world is actually round. Almost universally, when they learn the world is round, when a parent or a teacher tells them, they first imagine the world looks like a pancake. Because this reconciles their perception that the world is flat with this new information that the world is round. I want to suggest that in the general population and even in the peace movement, there is a lot of world is pancake type misunderstandings about the nature of nonviolent resistance. Misunderstandings that, if persistent, will make a nonviolent defense system less viable. Here's just one example. And I'm hardly the first one to identify this. One misunderstanding is that nonviolent resistance works because you convert the enemy. This is fundamentally not the case. Now, it is true that one of the effects of nonviolent resistance is a change of heart. Enemy soldiers can quit their jobs, and you might win sympathy from members of the other side. No nonviolent movement succeeded through conversion and persuasion alone. There are always people who will feel forced by nonviolent resistance, and it's a form of nonviolent coercion. So my point here is that if most people think that the theory is nonviolence works because it converts people, then a nonviolent defense system is probably less viable because that's just not how it works. So I'll pause here in just a summary of this first point. First, I've been talking about a widespread nonviolence literacy. I've defined this loosely as a basic understanding of the methods and mechanisms of nonviolence. I think it's possible that this kind of literacy can spread across a society. I think it's probably a generational project, but I think it's important. I've also claimed that this literacy is a necessary condition for the transition to a viable and durable nonviolent defense system. Again, like COVID, the SERB, nonviolent defense can be an emergency action by government, but for it to be the policy, we need, I'm claiming we need a widespread nonviolent literacy. So 2 questions I'll leave you with before I move on. Does this claim resonate with you, including those of you who are online? My claim that a widespread nonviolent literacy is actually a necessary condition long-term for this policy. Second, if so, What would you imagine the content of this nonviolent literacy to be? What methods would people need to know? And what mechanisms would they need to understand? I want to now transition to the second and third conditions. What must the general population be willing and able to do to make a nonviolent defense viable? What do people need to will, and what do they need to skill for this to work? Once again, I'm not going to be exhaustive, but I hope this is good food for thought. In terms of values, I would say, first of all, people must abhor violence. Note, I'm not saying that people need to be pacifists, but people need to hate violence and have a widespread understanding that violence is, to use just war language, always evil, but sometimes necessary. I think this is a fundamental attitude that must be present in a society for nonviolent defense to be viable. I think if people had militaristic attitudes that celebrate violence, it just won't work. Relatedly, there also must be a valuing of human life above other goods that might be achieved through violence. Here, I'm talking about an almost kind of cultural asceticism that would say, hey, if the choice is between our relative poverty and invading this country for resources so we can go on vacations, we would choose relative poverty. That's a really stark term, but I believe that type of belief, that high valuing of the life of the other over my comforts or our comforts, actually has to be part of the cultural equation. I'm going to skip some of my other thoughts here, but I'll just leave you with these two questions. I've claimed that there are societal values, and I gave a couple of examples of them, that need to be widespread to make a nonviolent defense systems viable. To what degree do you think this is true? And secondly, what specific values do you think need to be widespread to make a nonviolent defense possible? The last thing I will talk about is skills. Values by themselves are not enough. People also need to have the ability to live out their values. I really value gardening. You should have seen my gardens in the past. They're kind of messy and all over the place. I think the same can be said of nonviolent defense. People need to have a specific set of values, but they also need to have the abilities to live them out. So what are these skills and abilities? Let me give you a couple of examples. Again, these are by no means exhaustive. I'm going to focus on specifically emotional regulation skills. Traditionally, this has also been the domain of religious or spiritual traditions. I don't know how else to say this, but fear and anger are going to be a big part of people's individual level of experience, particularly in an invasion. Obviously, facing the violence of an invader will make you both very afraid and very angry. Psychologists and philosophers have talked about courage as a skill, the ability to manage and to cultivate fearlessness in really terrible situations. Militaries themselves have often focused on how do you develop this skill in people. And what I'm saying is that the kind of courage that militaries try to develop in soldiers is the kind of courage we'll actually need to have widespread in society. Nonviolent defense faces a greater challenge than military defense at developing courage as a kind of skill. Again, first of all, it's not just soldiers who need it, but it's everyone. Second of all, it actually as practitioners of nonviolence have taught us, it takes more courage to face violence non-violently than to face it with violence. It's more risky and more scary, and so we'll need more of that courage. Secondly, skillful management of anger is also really critical. To face a violent invading force without becoming violent yourself, without becoming furious and hateful, is very difficult. That's why Gandhi and every movement after him has emphasized nonviolent discipline. If we're thinking about how population is ready for a nonviolent defense system, we have to think about not only courage, but actually a willingness to cultivate certain values that seem religious or otherworldly in some sense, like a willingness to almost love enemy, as strong as that sounds, is actually a very practical, realistic requirement in this type of defense system. Because I think history has shown that it's easy to lose nonviolent discipline if you don't have that. Again, I'm just to shorten my time. I'll leave it here in two questions for you before I move on to my conclusion. I have now claimed that certain skills need to be widespread to make a nonviolent defense system viable. To what degree do you think this is true? Additionally, what specific skills would you identify as necessary on a population level if we were to have a nonviolent defense system? So where does this leave us? Gene Sharp proposed that a nonviolent defense system is possible and proposed a long-term process of transarmament, transitioning from a military defense system to a nonviolent defense system. He based this on the actual existing movements using nonviolent resistance. He developed a careful study of such movements, their methods, and their mechanisms for change. In turn, his studies supported new nonviolent movements, helping them grow and expand their impact. Here's an interesting anomaly, and I'll leave you with this. Many of the movements that have used nonviolent resistance did not extend this to nonviolent defense systems. India used nonviolence to free itself from the British and then built nuclear weapons. Civil rights activists who put their bodies on the line nonviolently got elected as congressional representatives and voted to fund the military. Almost every nation who successfully overthrew dictators nonviolently maintained standing armies. I want to suggest that this anomaly can be explained by the fact that their populations were ready for specific nonviolent campaigns, were not fully prepared for nonviolent defense systems. In my presentation, sorry, I'm getting confused with the pages here. In my presentation, I have focused on general populations, what they need to know, and what they must be willing and able to do for the transition to nonviolent defense systems to be more than an ad hoc emergency response, but to be a durable cultural and political transformation. So what I've proposed is essentially a research agenda. It says, hey, nonviolent defense systems are really important and they're reasonable. But given their nature, there are these conditions that need to be met. And how are we going to meet them? Thank you.
You can see easily that our speakers have much more to say than there is time, and I'm sure it'll come out on the questions. Magdalee?
Okay. So I'm going to be looking at the topic for today from a very different perspective. So not really from a Canadian perspective, but more so thinking from Caribbean and post-colonial context, and sort of expanding beyond nonviolent abolition of war. So how do we abolish war in our societies? And of course, as we're having this discussion, it is not happening in an abstract philosophical context. We are seeing a war being the dominant theme in our world as we speak. So I will try to also use a Black feminist perspective to ask deeper questions about abolition. So before I express any critique, I want to start by sort of looking back at Sharp's work and some of the key arguments and assumptions there. So the first one is, so Sharp argues that war persists not because it is morally desirable, but because it functions as a kind of historically entrenched security technology. So it serves as a mechanism to provide security, so people have a sense of security against existential danger. So according to Sharp, war is not a first preference, but it is a fallback when other forms of security are perceived as unreliable. And it develops a really, I think, which is really relevant, theory um, of power, like political power, that is based on consent. So he's saying that so power is not fully reliant on coercive violence, but it relies as well on social cooperation, on the legitimacy, obedience, and institutional participation of members of society. So as I was saying, the goal is not really to convert opponents, but to disrupt their ability to govern. So essentially, in the case that an invader would come, making the society somewhat unrulable, so that they are not able to impose their domination in that setting. Another major argument by Sharp is that war persists because societies lack a credible alternative mechanism for protection. So as I was saying, that's consent-based theory of power I think is a really good addition from like a really interesting contribution of this reading. But there's a number of assumptions within Sharp's theory that can be that can make the theory really incomplete when we think about contemporary context. So first, the Sharp presumes a Weberian state. So again, this idea of a state that has the monopoly of power over its territory. So this is the kind of state that can mobilize its population in order to develop a kind of nonviolent defense system, as was discussed earlier. But if we think about so many post-colonial and more conflict-affected contexts, you don't necessarily see that sovereign state with full control over their territory. What you'll often see is really like hybrid governance structures where the state is really having to exist alongside armed groups, alongside other forms of authorities, international actors, and formal networks of power as well. So if we look at from Hezbollah to the garrison communities in Jamaica to the situation in Haiti with the really territorially powerful armed groups, we don't see the kind of state that has that authority and sovereignty over their territory in order to implement the defense system that is being discussed here. And this is a really common form that we find in many parts of the world where those kind of hybrid system exist. And when it comes to war itself, so Sharp himself admits that both the causes and forms of war evolved over time. And that's definitely what we're seeing. And a lot of theories, contemporary theories on war, will tell you that it has evolved. So in a lot of the cases now, we're not necessarily seeing interstate wars. We're not seeing the kind of invasion that Sharp was discussing. We see more complicated conflict with digital elements, with transnational elements embedded within them. We see internal conflicts, as I was saying, with multiple actors that are facing off each other on a specific territory. So then who are the civilians protecting themselves from? When the enemy is not as easily identifiable as an external invader, how do you mobilize in that sense to build a nonviolent civilian defense? So that is one point of contention when looking at Sharp's perspective. So again, the states, it presumes really that there is this kind of baseline institutional environment where nonviolent collective action can really like exert pressure and recognize and really organize power relation. And then there is also this perspective that those invading actors would somewhat care about, the political legitimacy. They would care about how much they are able to govern over that territory. And again, what we see in other parts of the world where we have armed groups that are functioning as sort of de facto governance actors, they don't necessarily rely on this kind of institutional cooperation or legitimacy or any kind of obedience from the people, as long as they have this steady supply of arms coming from other places, in the case of my country coming from the United States, and case a lot of places where this violence is happening, as long as they can rely on that and they can continue their actions to extract, to exaction and blockade and whatnot, they are perfectly able to continue remaining in power without necessarily needing any kind of support from the population at large. So then that removes one really powerful possibility here, that like a nonviolent defense could be put into place in this context. So again, so the idea here is that Sharpe's perspective is really a perspective of defense that is oriented primarily towards occupation, invasion, and some kind of centralized authoritarian usurpation of power, which, again, in the world that we live in, with how much sovereignty and authority has evolved, it is not really complicate that framework and how generalizable it is and how universal it could be to actually put an end to war in the way that it happened in most places. But another aspect that's important to consider and that doesn't really show in the paper is the idea that armed conflict itself can become economically self-sustaining. So war generates revenue streams. So as I said, through looting, resource extraction, smuggling, taxation of territory, and control over trade routes. So in those places where armed groups control large part of the territory, they are able to control access to jobs, transport, food, and migration routes. So that means for a lot of people, withdrawing cooperation from those armed groups is really life-threatening for them. But that also means that there are so many incentives to actually continue maintaining a situation of conflict because of those economic revenues. And if we extend this perspective beyond really thinking about local conflict, we can see how war is embedded in the global political economy. So the contemporary international system includes this vast military industrial infrastructure that links state to private firms, to research institutions, to logistics networks, and to financial markets. So weapons production, surveillance technology, cybersecurity contract, private security services, all of that form a really integrated economic sector that relies on war. And even without any war happening, the constant preparation for war is a reality of our global system. So again, even with the recent conflict, we can imagine how that is already activating, global arms supply chain, missile defense industries, and how oil prices and stock markets are affected, where people were maybe expecting this to happen, and some people are making money from this happening. So there is this big industry that is configured around war, and that creates incentives for the perpetuation of war and makes us go further away from any hope of abolition. But there's also another argument to be made, is that militaries are also not just defense instruments. So in a lot of countries, the military recruitment, especially in places where large parts of the population, especially young men, are being marginalized, military recruitment can serve as a pathway for those working class youth to access some kind of education or stable income, which means that militarization in that case become an economic structure that is actually supporting some people within that community. So we're not able to have these people buy in into a demilitarized society if we're not offering an alternative. And again, war is also, militarization is also cultural. So it's not just about armies and weapons. It is how through everyday life we are, our imaginaries are shaped around this idea of, militarized protection. So from, the moment we're in school to the movies that we're watching and whatnot, how collective, imagination is shaped around the idea of war and militarization as our best bet for any kind of protection. So when Sharp civilian defense system presuppose that society can really deliberately shift away from military security thinking and cultivate this disciplined nonviolent defense system, we can look at, authors like Cynthia and Lowe to ask, how deeply embedded are those militarized assumptions in everyday political imagination? So that means to really go towards a nonviolent defense system, we would need to confront not just, external aggressors, but also the deeply internalized security imaginaries within our society. So Sharp does observe that military security is embedded in popular political imagination, but he assumed that it is only because there has not been like a credible alternative. That if people were offered a good enough alternative, like they would reject militarization and war. But I think what is missing from this explanation is like a really deeper interrogation of why this sort of thinking becomes naturalized in the first place. So if we go from like a Black feminist and political economy perspective, we can see that those militarized imaginaries are the outcome of historical processes of colonial conquest, racial hierarchy, and capitalist state formations. The system that we live in, the capitalist system itself, was built on violence and has to justify that violence from its inception. And so there is a long history as to why we have collectively this perception of violence as being a natural part of our societies. So those militarization, as I was saying, it reproduces itself through education, through gender norms, through labor organization, and through national identity. A lot of what we see as national identity patriotism is built around, some idea of militarization. So going back again to this mention of capitalism, so Sharps briefly asserts in the paper that the abolition of capitalism would not automatically abolish wars. But I think this statement sort of leaves undiscussed the relationship between economic structure and organized violence. So it is technically correct since political conflict has existed under multiple economic systems. So we cannot necessarily say that war is fully caused by capitalism, but we have to admit that the global capitalist accumulation system sustain and profit from the existence of war. So as I was saying earlier, armed conflict can become economically self-sustaining, and violence generate revenues for a lot of actors in the current system that we exist in. So that means that beyond a fully technical question of shifting to a nonviolent defense, maybe we need to think about really transforming the economic and ideological system that make violence, like organized violence, materially and culturally sustainable in our societies. So again, like going back to this like Black feminist perspective, we, as I was saying from the beginning, war, especially in our contemporary world, is not just about interstate armed conflict. It's not just about invasion. And for many racialized and colonized communities, this kind of militarized violence is continuous through policing, occupation, economic extraction, border regimes, and gender domination. So thinking about the US, for example, our surveillance technologies used for war in other contexts are then we use at home to control their own population. Think about the tools that have been used to control borders between the US and Mexico, for example. So from this vantage point, war is not just this single event of, on the ground confrontation, but it is this continuum of organized violence that really regulate mobility, labor, and social reproduction of people in this society. And so Sharp's model does really emphasize the nation state as this primary actor that will organize nonviolent defense. But for a lot of racialized population, the state itself can be seen as a violent actor and as a source of harm. So a state-led civilian defense strategy could promise some kind of protection from, foreign invasion, but it would still leave intact the domestic systems of policing and conservation and abandonment that a lot of people in society have experienced. So civilian mobilization without really transforming these deeper structures would not lead to like liberation for everyone in society. And if you look at specific from like Angela Davis, for example, so as I was saying, militarism abroad and repression enforcing. Again, those weapons that are tested in conflicts are the similar thing that are against used in domestic policing. And the same sort of political economy that sustain overseas military bases also sustain, building more prisons and austerity policies in marginalized communities. So Sharp's approach might really focus on those really spectacular, most visible form of war, but not of the war that a lot of people are experiencing daily in their communities or how it's been used against marginalized communities. And I think that is something that we also need to pay attention to. And so finally, I'll say like drawing on Wood Wilson Gilmore, when we talk about abolition, really abolition war in the way I see it, it wouldn't just be about eliminating the militaries, it wouldn't just be about developing a nonviolent like civilian defense, but it would also be about creating better, more just and equal institutions that would change the way that society is organized. So that would mean that we would build infrastructures that will make organized violence both socially and politically unnecessary. So all the money, the public resources that are flowing into armed industries like border fortification and surveillance technologies should be used to invest in land, labor, and health to actually improve the conditions of the majority of society. And then maybe there would be that support that we are talking about for some kind of nonviolent defense. So really abolition war has to be material. It has to really move beyond this technical, strategic, rational perspective that Sharp is developing, that there is like supposedly there are clear costs and benefits, and if state would just see the benefits of nonviolent civilian defense, we would have that been implemented in our societies, and this would eventually lead to the abolition of war. Like I think this is a simplified perspective. So as I was saying, sort of summarizing the different points that I've talked about, there is the fact that the Cold War world that Sharp was writing about has changed a lot, and what war means has also evolved. The capacity of state to actually implement what has been suggested here is not universally existent. So what happened then to those places where the state does not have that sovereignty, that monopoly of violence that is presupposed here? So that's one first question. But then the second part of this question is we cannot just see it again from this technical perspective where we don't think about how much war is embedded within the economic and political system that we exist in, and how it is also embedded in our societies and culture, so that if we are actually to abolish war, it requires a more transformative work to look at the structures that is causing war to continue and to persist in our societies. It is not just a technical discussion, it is a very political one. Thank you.